After enduring a bitter and draining divorce, Lydia Bennett was desperate for a fresh start. The ink on the divorce papers had barely dried when she packed her belongings and moved across the state to a quaint suburban neighborhood in Woodridge, Illinois. It was the kind of place where the lawns were always neatly trimmed, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the streets on Sunday mornings. Lydia hoped that this picturesque environment would help her heal and put the painful memories of her marriage behind her. Her new home, a charming two-story house with a white picket fence, stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was perfect, almost too perfect. The neighbors were friendly enough, waving from their driveways as she unpacked her U-Haul. They seemed eager to welcome the new face to the community, and Lydia found herself cautiously optimistic about her new life. On her first evening, as she struggled to arrange her furniture, there was a knock at the door. Lydia opened it to find a woman in her early 40s standing on the porch, holding a plate of cookies. She had warm brown eyes and a smile that radiated kindness. "Hi there, I'm Karen," the woman said, extending her hand. "I live just across the street and thought I'd come over to welcome you to the neighborhood." Lydia shook her hand, grateful for the gesture. "Thank you, Karen. I'm Lydia. It's nice to meet you." Karen handed her the cookies, wrapped in a red checkered cloth. "I know moving can be stressful, so I figured some chocolate chip cookies might help." Lydia smiled, feeling a little more at ease. "That's so thoughtful. Would you like to come in?" "I'd love to, but I have to run some errands. But if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. We're a close-knit community here," Karen said, glancing briefly over her shoulder as if checking to see if anyone was watching. As Lydia closed the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about Karen's demeanor was off. It was subtle, but there had been a flicker of something in her eyes. Was it fear? Or was Lydia just projecting her own anxieties onto this friendly stranger? Shrugging it off, Lydia put the cookies on the kitchen counter and decided to call it a night. Tomorrow was a new day, and she had high hopes that this move would mark the beginning of a peaceful chapter in her life. Little did she know, the darkness she had tried to leave behind was far from over. It had simply followed her into her new neighborhood, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Lydia settled into her new routine with surprising ease. She spent her days working remotely as an interior designer and her evenings exploring the neighborhood. The quiet streets and friendly neighbors provided a sense of safety she hadn't felt in years. But despite the outward tranquility, Lydia couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Karen, the neighbor who had welcomed her with cookies, became a regular presence in Lydia's life. They shared morning coffee on the porch and occasionally went for walks around the neighborhood. Karen was easy to talk to, and Lydia found herself opening up about her past more than she had intended. She told Karen about the divorce, the years of emotional abuse, and the reason she had left everything behind. "I'm so sorry you went through that," Karen said one afternoon as they sat on Lydia's porch, sipping iced tea. "You deserve a fresh start." Lydia nodded, staring into her glass. "I thought I'd feel better after leaving, but sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing. It's hard to let go of the past." Karen's expression darkened for a split second before she forced a smile. "You'll be fine, Lydia. You're strong." There was something in Karen's tone that made Lydia pause. It was almost as if she was speaking from experience, but before Lydia could ask, Karen changed the subject to a local book club she thought Lydia might enjoy. The moment passed, but it left Lydia with a lingering sense of unease. As the days went by, Lydia noticed odd things around her new home. A shadow in the window late at night, the sensation of being watched, and objects that seemed to move from where she had left them. At first, she dismissed it all as paranoia, a byproduct of the trauma she had endured during her marriage, but the feeling persisted, gnawing at her. One evening, as she was sorting through old photographs in her living room, Lydia came across a picture of her ex-husband, Derek. His cold blue eyes stared back at her from the photo, a reminder of the man she had once loved but now feared. She quickly shoved the picture back into the box, her hands trembling. She wanted to forget him, to erase every trace of him from her life, but he was like a ghost haunting her even now. That night, she bolted the doors and windows, something she hadn't done since moving in. As she climbed into bed, she heard a faint noise outside, like the creaking of footsteps on the porch. Lydia's heart raced as she lay in the dark, listening intently. But the noise didn't come again, and eventually, exhaustion took over, pulling her into a restless sleep. In the days that followed, Lydia found herself increasingly on edge. She began to withdraw, avoiding the neighbors and spending most of her time indoors. Karen noticed the change and tried to reach out, but Lydia was reluctant to share her fears. She didn't want to appear weak or unstable, especially not to someone she had just met. But as much as she tried to convince herself otherwise, Lydia knew deep down that something was terribly wrong. The neighborhood that had once seemed like a safe haven was starting to feel like a prison. And whatever secrets she had buried in her past, it seemed they were about to catch up with her in ways she couldn't have imagined. The days grew shorter as fall crept into Woodridge, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Lydia continued to isolate herself, the sense of unease gnawing at her more with each passing day. Her work, once a welcome distraction, now felt like a burden, She struggled to concentrate, her mind constantly drifting back to the mysterious occurrences in her home. Lydia's anxiety reached a peak one night when she received a strange phone call. The number was blocked, and the voice on the other end was low and distorted, sending chills down her spine. "Lydia, you can't run forever." Her breath caught in her throat. The voice was unfamiliar, yet the message was terrifyingly clear. She hung up immediately, her heart pounding in her chest. Was it a prank? Or had Derek somehow found her? The thought made her feel sick. Derek had never been physically violent, but his cruelty had always been psychological, manipulative, calculated, and relentless. Lydia sat in the darkened living room, clutching her phone, the silence of the house pressing down on her. She knew she should call the police, but what would she tell them? A vague, threatening phone call with no proof. She'd sound paranoid, just like Derek had always accused her of being. Instead, she called Karen, her hands trembling as she dialed the number. Karen answered on the second ring, her voice cheerful but laced with concern when she heard Lydia's shaky voice. "Karen, I think someone's been watching me. And I just got a call someone knows where I am," Lydia whispered, barely able to get the words out. Karen was silent for a moment. "Lydia, you need to stay calm. Do you want me to come over? We can figure this out together." Lydia hesitated. As much as she appreciated Karen's support, part of her didn't want to involve anyone else, but she also knew she couldn't handle this alone. "Yes, please," she finally said, relief flooding her as Karen agreed to come right over. When Karen arrived, she found Lydia sitting on the couch, pale and visibly shaken. Karen immediately took charge, locking all the doors and checking the windows before sitting down next to Lydia. "Tell me everything," Karen said, her voice firm but kind. Lydia recounted the events of the past few weeks, the mysterious noises, the feeling of being watched, and now the phone call. As she spoke, she could see the concern growing in Karen's eyes. But there was something else there too, something Lydia couldn't quite place. When Lydia finished, Karen sat back, deep in thought. "Lydia, I think it might be time to consider that Derek could be behind this. Maybe he's trying to scare you, make you think you're losing your mind again." The suggestion hit Lydia like a punch to the gut. She had moved across the state to escape Derek, but had she underestimated him? Could he really have tracked her down? "I don't know how he could have found me," Lydia said, her voice wavering. "I've been so careful." Karen reached out and squeezed Lydia's hand. "Listen, you're not alone in this. We'll figure it out. Maybe we should go to the police." Lydia nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. "Maybe you're right. I just don't want to seem paranoid." "Better safe than sorry," Karen replied. But as she spoke, Lydia noticed a flicker of something in her eyes, fear. Or was it something else? Before Lydia could dwell on it, Karen offered to stay the night. Grateful, Lydia agreed. They spent the evening in the living room, watching television and talking about anything but the phone call. As the hours passed, Lydia began to relax, even managing to laugh at one of the ridiculous reality shows Karen had chosen. But when the night grew late and the house fell silent, Lydia found herself lying awake, unable to shake the feeling that something was very wrong. She listened to the steady breathing of Karen, who had fallen asleep on the couch beside her. Lydia knew she should sleep too, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She kept replaying the phone call in her head, the distorted voice, the chilling words. Was it really Derek? Or was it someone else? And if it was Derek, how had he found her? Lydia had taken every precaution to disappear: new phone, new address, no forwarding information. The thought that he could track her down despite all of that was terrifying. As Lydia lay there, staring at the ceiling, a sudden realization struck her. The only person who knew everything about her past, her fears, even her new address, was Karen. The thought was absurd, she told herself. Karen was her friend, the only person who had been there for her since she moved to Woodridge. But as the night stretched on, doubt began to creep into Lydia's mind. She glanced at Karen, sleeping peacefully beside her, and felt a shiver run down her spine. What if Karen wasn't who she claimed to be? What if Lydia had trusted the wrong person? The idea seemed impossible, yet Lydia couldn't shake it. There were too many coincidences, too many moments that didn't add up. Lydia felt trapped, the walls of the house closing in on her. She had fled from her past, only to find herself entangled in a new web of fear and uncertainty. And the worst part was, she didn't know who to trust anymore. The next morning, Lydia woke with a heavy heart and a gnawing sense of dread. Karen was still asleep on the couch, her breathing soft and even. Lydia quietly slipped out of bed and headed to the kitchen, her mind racing with the thoughts that had plagued her through the night. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, Lydia couldn't shake the suspicion that had taken root in her mind. She felt guilty for doubting Karen, who had been nothing but kind and supportive since she moved in. But something about the situation just didn't sit right with her. Lydia decided to investigate, just to put her mind at ease. She didn't want to believe that Karen was involved in anything sinister, but she needed to be sure. After all, her instincts had warned her before, and she had ignored them to her detriment. While Karen was still asleep, Lydia slipped upstairs to her home office and opened her laptop. She knew it was a long shot, but she decided to do a quick search on Karen, her full name, her address, anything that might give her some insight. As she typed Karen's name into the search engine, her hands trembled slightly. The results were surprisingly sparse. There were a few social media profiles, but they were all locked down, with little information visible to the public. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first glance, but something still felt off. Lydia's unease grew when she noticed an obituary for a woman named Karen Masters, someone with the same name as her neighbor. The obituary was dated 3 years ago, and the woman had lived in a small town just a few hours away. The photo attached to the obituary looked eerily similar to the Karen Lydia knew, though it was hard to be certain. Confused and alarmed, Lydia clicked on the link, her heart pounding. The obituary mentioned that the woman had died in a car accident under mysterious circumstances, and that she had left behind a husband and a young daughter. But what really caught Lydia's attention was the mention of an ongoing investigation into Karen's death, suggesting that it might not have been an accident after all. Lydia's mind raced as she tried to make sense of the information. Could it be a coincidence, or was the Karen she knew somehow connected to this tragic event? The more Lydia thought about it, the more uneasy she felt. What if the woman sleeping on her couch wasn't who she claimed to be? Lydia shut the laptop, her hands shaking. She needed answers, but she wasn't sure how to get them without raising suspicion. Confronting Karen directly seemed too risky, especially if her suspicions were correct. Instead, Lydia decided to keep a close eye on Karen, watching for anything that might confirm her fears. As the day wore on, Lydia couldn't help but notice how easily Karen slipped back into her role as the supportive friend. They spent the day together, running errands and chatting about trivial things, but Lydia's mind was elsewhere. She kept replaying the information she had found, trying to connect the dots. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Lydia finally gathered the courage to ask Karen about her past. She brought it up casually, as if she was just making conversation. "So, Karen, I realized I don't know much about where you're from. Have you always lived in Woodridge?" Karen paused for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, before answering with a smile. "Oh, I've moved around a bit. I used to live in a small town not too far from here, but I came to Woodridge for a fresh start, like you." Lydia nodded, trying to mask her growing suspicion. "That sounds nice. Why did you decide to leave?" Karen's smile faltered slightly, and she looked away, fiddling with her fork. "I needed a change. My husband passed away a few years ago, and it was hard to stay in the same place with all the memories. Woodridge seemed like a good place to start over." Lydia's heart raced as Karen's story mirrored the details from the obituary. Was it possible that Karen had taken on a new identity after her husband's death, or was Lydia simply letting her paranoia get the best of her? As the evening wore on, Lydia found it increasingly difficult to keep up the facade of normalcy. She wanted to believe that Karen was the friend she desperately needed, but the nagging doubt wouldn't go away. The secrets that Lydia had tried so hard to leave behind were now entangled with Karen's, and the more Lydia learned, the more she realized that her fresh start was quickly turning into a nightmare. Lydia knew she had to be careful. If Karen was hiding something, Lydia couldn't afford to make a wrong move. She decided to gather more information, to dig deeper into Karen's past without tipping her off. Lydia's safety depended on it, but as she delved into the mystery, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time. Over the next few days, Lydia's paranoia only deepened. She spent hours scouring the internet, trying to piece together any information she could find about Karen Masters. The obituary haunted her, and the similarities between Karen's story and the details in the article were too close to ignore. Lydia was desperate for answers, but she knew that her search for the truth was fraught with danger. She started to notice little things about Karen that seemed off. Karen's friendliness, once comforting, now felt forced. But her questions about Lydia's life had become more probing, as if she was trying to extract something specific from her. Lydia also began to suspect that Karen was watching her more closely than before, casual glances that lingered too long, unexpected visits at odd hours. It was as if Karen was waiting for Lydia to slip up. One evening, after Karen had left her house following an impromptu dinner invitation, Lydia decided she couldn't wait any longer. She needed to know the truth, no matter the cost. As soon as Karen was out of sight, Lydia grabbed her coat and hurried across the street to Karen's house. She had never been inside, and something told her that was intentional on Karen's part. Lydia's heart raced as she approached the front door. She hesitated for a moment, then tried the handle. To her surprise, it was unlocked. A chill ran down her spine as she stepped inside, her senses on high alert. The interior of Karen's house was neat, almost sterile, with none of the personal touches that Lydia had expected. It felt more like a carefully curated display than a home. Lydia's unease grew as she moved through the rooms, each one more devoid of personality than the last. There were no family photos, no keepsakes, nothing that hinted at who Karen really was. Lydia's search led her to the bedroom, where she noticed a small wooden box on the dresser. It was the only item that seemed out of place in the otherwise pristine room. Her hands trembling, Lydia opened the box and gasped at what she found inside. The box contained a collection of photographs, all of them old and yellowed with age. But what made Lydia's blood run cold was the fact that they were all of her images from years ago, taken without her knowledge. There were photos of her and Derek, smiling together in happier times, followed by more recent pictures from her life in Woodridge. Lydia's breath caught in her throat as she realized that someone had been watching her for a long time, long before she had even met Karen. As she rifled through the photos, she found a few more items buried beneath them: a newspaper clipping about Derek's business dealings, a copy of their divorce papers, and a folded letter with her name scrawled across the front in Derek's handwriting. With shaking hands, Lydia unfolded the letter. The message was short, but it filled her with dread. "Lydia, you can't escape what you've done. You'll always be mine, D." The implications of the letter were clear. Derek had been orchestrating this from the start, and Karen was somehow involved. But how? And why? Lydia was so absorbed in the discovery that she didn't hear the soft click of the front door closing or the quiet footsteps approaching from behind. When she finally turned around, Karen was standing in the doorway, her expression cold and unreadable. "What are you doing in my house, Lydia?" Karen's voice was calm, almost too calm, and that frightened Lydia more than anything. Lydia tried to compose herself, holding the letter behind her back. I just wanted to check on you. You left so quickly, and I was worried." Karen's eyes narrowed as she took a step forward. "That's very considerate of you, but I think we both know that's not why you're here." Lydia's mind raced, trying to come up with an excuse, but it was clear that Karen wasn't buying it. The tension in the room was palpable, and Lydia knew she had to think fast. But before she could say anything, Karen glanced at the box on the dresser and her expression darkened. "You shouldn't have gone through my things, Lydia," Karen said, her voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Lydia backed away slowly, her heart pounding. "Karen, I don't understand what's going on. How do you know Derek?" Karen's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Oh, Lydia, it's not Derek you should be worried about." The words hung in the air, thick with menace. Lydia's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but she couldn't deny the fear coursing through her veins. Karen took another step forward, and Lydia knew she had to get out of there. Without warning, Lydia bolted for the door, her adrenaline spiking as she heard Karen call out behind her. "You can't run, Lydia. It's too late for that." Lydia didn't look back as she sprinted out of the house and into the cold night air. She ran blindly, not caring where she was going as long as she put as much distance between herself and Karen as possible. But no matter how far she ran, Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was closing in on her, and there was nowhere left to hide. Lydia ran until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out. She had no destination in mind, only the overwhelming need to escape the suffocating terror that Karen had brought into her life. The quiet streets of Woodridge, which had once seemed so idyllic, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and unseen threats. Finally, exhausted and disoriented, Lydia found herself at the edge of town, near a small park she had only visited once before. She collapsed onto a bench, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to collect her thoughts. How had everything spiraled so far out of control? Who was Karen really, and what did she want with Lydia? The letter from Derek had been the final straw. Lydia knew that whatever was happening, it was connected to him. But Derek wasn't here, Karen was. And that meant Karen held the answers Lydia so desperately needed. But how could she confront Karen when it was clear that she was far more dangerous than Lydia had ever imagined? As she sat there in the dark, Lydia's mind raced, trying to piece together a plan. She couldn't go back to her house, not while Karen was there. And going to the police seemed pointless. What could she tell them? That her neighbor might be involved in some convoluted plot against her. They'd never believe her without proof. Lydia knew she needed help, but she had no one to turn to. Her friends were back in her old town, and she had cut ties with them after the divorce. Here in Woodridge, she was alone, isolated, and vulnerable. But she couldn't just sit and wait for Karen to make her next move. She had to take control of the situation, no matter how terrified she felt. Gathering her resolve, Lydia decided she needed to find out more about Karen, who she really was, and what her connection to Derek might be. The only person who might have that information was someone who had been close to Karen in the past. Lydia remembered the obituary she had found earlier, the one mentioning Karen's husband and daughter. If she could track down the daughter, maybe she could get some answers. But first, Lydia needed a safe place to stay while she figured out her next steps. She couldn't risk going home, and she didn't trust any of the neighbors enough to ask for help. The only option was to check into a motel on the outskirts of town and lay low for a while. Lydia pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she searched for nearby motels. She found one a few miles away and quickly booked a room. With a destination in mind, she forced herself to stand and start walking. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from her footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As she walked, Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder every few minutes, her nerves on edge, but she saw no one. Still, the sense of unease lingered, a constant reminder that she was far from safe. When Lydia finally reached the motel, she checked in quickly, avoiding the gaze of the bored-looking clerk behind the counter. She paid in cash, not wanting to leave a paper trail, and hurried to her room. Once inside, she locked the door, checked the windows, and then sank onto the bed, her body shaking with exhaustion and fear. The room was small and shabby, but at least it felt secure. Lydia knew she couldn't stay there for long, but it would have to do for the night. She pulled out her laptop and began searching for any information she could find about Karen's daughter. The obituary had mentioned her by name, Emily Masters, and Lydia hoped that would be enough to track her down. It didn't take long to find a social media profile that matched the description. Emily was in her early 20s, with long dark hair and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Her profile was private, but there were a few public posts that Lydia could see. One of them, dated just a few months ago, mentioned the loss of her mother and the ongoing investigation into her death. Lydia's heart pounded as she read the post. This was her chance to get the answers she needed. She quickly composed a message to Emily, trying to keep her tone calm and sincere, despite the panic coursing through her veins. "Hi Emily, my name is Lydia Bennett. I know this might seem strange, but I think I knew your mother. I'm trying to find out more about what happened to her. If you're willing, I'd really appreciate the chance to talk." Lydia hesitated for a moment before hitting send. She had no idea how Emily would react, or if she would even see the message, but it was the only lead Lydia had, and she couldn't afford to waste any more time. As she waited for a response, Lydia's thoughts drifted back to Karen. The woman she had thought was a friend was now a shadowy figure in her mind, a predator lurking just out of sight. Lydia knew she couldn't rest until she uncovered the truth, but the more she delved into Karen's past, the more she feared what she might find. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity, as Lydia stared at her phone, willing it to light up with a reply. When the notification finally came, her heart skipped a beat. Emily had responded. The message was short and to the point. "I'm in town. Let's meet tomorrow morning. I'll send the address." Lydia exhaled a shaky breath, relief washing over her. She had a plan now, a way to get to the bottom of the nightmare that had consumed her life. But as she lay down to sleep, her mind wouldn't let her rest. The darkness in Karen's past was a reflection of the darkness in Lydia's own, and she knew that uncovering the truth might be more dangerous than she could ever imagine. Lydia's hands trembled as she followed the directions Emily had sent her. She arrived at a small, quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town, far from the picturesque Woodridge streets she had once felt safe in. When she walked in, her eyes immediately found Emily sitting in a corner booth, her dark hair pulled into a tight ponytail, eyes sharp and watchful. Lydia's heart raced, knowing this meeting could be the key to everything. As Lydia approached, Emily stood up to greet her, the tension between them palpable. They exchanged brief pleasantries before Emily dove straight into it. "You said you knew my mom. What exactly do you want to know?" Emily asked, her tone flat but not unkind. Lydia hesitated, unsure how to begin. "I moved to Woodridge a few months ago, and I've been friends with your mother, or at least I thought I was. But things have gotten strange dark, and I need to understand what's going on." Emily's expression shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing. "You've been talking to Karen?" she asked, a bitter edge to her voice. Lydia blinked in confusion. "Yes, I've been talking to Karen. I thought she was your mother." Emily shook her head slowly. "Karen Masters isn't my mother. My mother, the real Karen, is dead. The woman you've been talking to, she's not who you think she is." Lydia felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean? Who is she?" Emily leaned in closer, her voice lowering as she explained. "After my mom died, our family was wrecked. But then, out of nowhere, this woman came into our lives. She claimed to have known my mom from years ago and became close to my father. Too close. Things were strange, and not long after my dad died too. The police said it was an accident, but I always had my suspicions." Lydia felt her stomach twist. "Are you saying she's dangerous?" Emily nodded, her eyes dark with anger. "She's not just dangerous. She's a master manipulator. I've been trying to gather enough proof to show the police, but she covers her tracks too well. You're not the first person she's latched onto." Lydia's mind reeled. The friendly, supportive neighbor she had trusted was nothing more than a predator and imposter. And if Karen wasn't really Karen, that meant everything Lydia knew was a lie. Emily continued. "I think she's using people, especially women like you. She preys on those who are vulnerable, those who need a fresh start. She did it to my dad, and now she's doing it to you." Lydia swallowed hard. "But why? What does she want?" Emily looked grim. "Control. Power. It's always the same with her. She makes you believe you need her, and by the time you realize something's wrong, it's too late. She's already taken over your life." Lydia's hands clenched into fists. The fear that had been simmering inside her for weeks now boiled into rage. Karen, whoever she was, had infiltrated Lydia's life, and she had fallen for it, but not anymore. "What do we do now?" Lydia asked, her voice shaking with anger. Emily leaned back, her eyes narrowing with determination. We need to expose her. There's a storage unit she used to rent under a fake name. I found out about it after my dad's death but couldn't break in without getting caught. If we're going to stop her, we have to go there and find something that ties her to my parents' deaths and to whatever she's planning for you. Lydia nodded, her resolve hardening. They were going to bring this monster down no matter what it took.